We are joined by Young Australian of the Year for 2015, Drisana Levitzke-Gray, and her interpreter, Christy Filipich. Welcome to the both of you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Now, Drisana, you're known as an advocate for Auslan, the sign language for Australia. What did you do to become so notable?
Well, for many years I've been involved in various aspects of advocacy. I'm a volunteer, and as well as working with voluntary groups, I also have to advocate every day for my own rights. As a deaf person growing up, I faced a lot of barriers, and when I got into high school, that's really when it really came to me that I had to stand up for my rights and how to go about advocating for those rights. I come from a deaf family, and so I had a lot of support at home with mum and dad telling me what I could do, what tools were out there that I could use to advocate for myself. Just to let you know, 95% of deaf children have hearing families, so they don't have those same role models that can show them how to get around those barriers and how to advocate for their rights and the choices that they might have. And so it also means that as I was growing up, a lot of the advocacy that I was doing was also on behalf of a lot of my deaf friends and family, deaf friends who didn't come from deaf families and have that same benefit. Since then, I've been involved in a number of leadership courses. I was in Europe for a year doing an international deaf youth leadership course, and I really had a look at who I was during that time and my identity, and I really felt that I wanted to do more to raise awareness of deaf people, of our culture, of our skills and our abilities, and particularly of our language. We have so much to offer society, and so it's really important that society recognise that. And my advocacy is over a range of things. Some of it is just awareness. Some of it is celebrating Auslan as a language. Some of it is correct terminology. So, for example, using deaf and hard of hearing instead of hearing impaired. Some of it is the right spelling of Auslan. A lot of people capitalise it, so they're kind of screaming Auslan every time they write it. So making sure that people are writing it in the correct way. I was also the first Auslan using deaf person to do jury duty. And so there's really been a number of things that have all come together that have mean I've been recognised with this award. And to have done so much before the age of 21 as well, I think that's why people seem to be very impressed.
Now, I was aware of the jury duty, but what other rights have you had to fight for?
Oh, it's more about, for example, providing Auslan interpreters on TV at the moment. That's something I've been working on for a couple of years. So in times of emergency and crisis, it's certainly become a lot better than it used to be. We see in Queensland with the floods, and we saw in New South Wales with fire, and South Australia as well. But it's actually not an instantaneous process that happens. We still need to call on government to do that each time. During the Sydney siege, we didn't have any interpreter provision during that period of time, and I know that it was a crisis and it was an emergency, and that may not have been foremost in people's minds, but we still needed access at that time to know what was happening. That was a huge thing in Sydney. We have a huge deaf population in Sydney, and we needed to know what was going on and to have that direct access in Auslan to press briefings and things like that that are going on. Anything that's happening live, we don't have the same access to the information unless there's an Auslan interpreter present. So the floods were fantastic, and the fires have been fantastic in terms of interpreter provision once they're called out on it. But there are still other situations like the Sydney siege where that doesn't occur. And so we need to have national guidelines, for example, and that's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment.
Now, let's raise some awareness of Auslan today. I think that a lot of people still have the idea that signed languages are basically just English with gestures, but they're not. It's its own language.
No, not at all.
It's its own language. It has its own structure. What is Auslan like?
Well, Auslanish is Australian Sign Language, and as you said, it has its own grammar, it has its own structure and syntax, the same as any other language. And that's how we have linguistic research to back up the fact that it is a true language. So I think one of the misconceptions is that a lot of people equate language with speech, and that is one of the problems that we need to that we need to solve. to get that misconception out of the way, that it doesn't matter what mode your language is, it's still a language. One of the things about English, for example, it's very linear. So you can only say one word at a time. And I describe Auslan as being a 3D language. So we're using body language, facial expression, hands, space, movement. A lot of people often tell me that I'm very animated. And I think, well, I'm not doing anything on purpose. That's how the language works. That's how you use the language. You create movements in space, and that automatically makes it a much more animated language than perhaps English.
I recall seeing during the Queensland floods, the Auslan interpreter who was actually there was one of the most expressive interpreters I've ever seen. He was this wonderfully, I don't want to say vivacious, but there was just this outpouring of energy in what he was doing. And it's not like he was happy, obviously. They were talking about a very serious subject, but the expressiveness contained in what he was communicating was just really impressive to see.
He used a really great use of depicting signs and things that we use in Auslan to show how things are happening. So he used space and he used expression. And as I said, that term about English being linear and Auslan being visual and spatial and gestural. So we use the space around us to show where something is happening and who it's happening to. So if you're talking about Queensland, for example, you can actually put Queensland in space and then show visually where certain events are occurring. And in English, we don't have that same facility. You have to use many, many words to talk about that.
What's fascinating for the benefit of our listeners who can't see what Daniel and I are able to see right now is that when Drisana was talking about positioning Queensland in space, you can actually see her positioning Queensland physically in space in front of her and positioning it relative to other things in space. And I really like what you said before about a 3D language. It mustn't seem like it to you, but to a person whose language is a very linear experience, it's really interesting. And it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very it's a switch of perception for people who don't experience a language in a way that you do, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah, those are very, very true statements from people who don't know our language.
Now, Auslan has a word order that's a little freer than spoken English. For example, if I want to say monkeys like bananas, I don't have to say the sign for monkeys and then the sign for likes and then the sign for bananas. I can do that many different ways.
Yeah, you could do it a number of different ways. So you could do monkey likes bananas, but that would be following an English rule pattern and not necessarily an Auslan grammar pattern. You could sign something like this, so monkeys, bananas, eating passionately. It's so for example, the cat sat on the mat. That is really difficult when for Auslan people, Auslan users to see like that. We would actually sign so that you can visually see that there is a mat and there is a cat lying on the mat. So you can actually see it in space. And if you see sort of my facial expression, for example, then it's showing that the cat is sleeping on the mat, for example, and is very comfortable and cozy on the mat. So it's one of those differences between Auslan and English and can make it difficult perhaps for people to understand when you're trying to explain Auslan without seeing it.
Now, you're a native speaker of Auslan. You had to learn English as a second language.
Yes.
Was that difficult to do? Are they quite different?
So having Auslan as my first language meant that I had language. I had complete access to communication and information around me. So learning English for me was easier than perhaps other deaf people, because if I was looking at a word and I didn't know what the word meant, I had people around me who could sign to me. So if I saw CAT and asked what that was, I could have someone sign to me, it's a cat, we've got one, and describe a cat to me. However, for a lot of hearing people who learn English, you see the word and then you have to, I don't know how it works for hearing people. I guess you equate that with words that you've heard. You have to sound it out and figure out how those syllables or those sounds equate to other words that you've heard in the past, perhaps. I know that I also happen to know a lot of other sign languages as well. So being bilingual in English and Auslan has made learning other languages much easier.
I have to ask, do you ever sign in your sleep?
I think, if I'm really tired or exhausted, and I know when family and my partner have tried to wake me up, I've sort of signed and not really known what I've been doing. But I've certainly heard from a lot of people, like that moment when you're trying to wake someone up from a dream, so they're not quite awake and they're sort of signing,
That must be a really interesting thing to witness, because just having someone mumble incoherently can be funny in its own regard, because there's just not concrete language taking place, let alone signing that and having, like you've said, that spatial awareness, which I would imagine when you're completely exhausted is not as strong as it normally is. Just kind of being like, oh.
Here on the show, we often like to talk about words that are new in spoken English. There are lots of them coming all the time. Is that true for Auslan? What are some new words that you've only just heard of?
We certainly do. A lot of new signs, in the same way that new words, they're linked to things that like technology. So we have signs for Glide, for example, and Twitter, so various social media apps that are used. So we do end up developing signs for those, and those we often find that a few signs might be created, and then eventually one sign will be the one that's used by everyone. Australia, we actually have a dialect in Australian Sign Language. So each state may have a different sign for Twitter, for example, and then when we come together at national things, or when we chat with a friend from Sydney, that's when we discover that there are these variations.
And naturally have a cage death match to figure out whose one goes national. 4 signs enter, 1 sign leave.
Something like that.
So any new ones?
I'm trying to think of one that's specific. I mean, there's...
Slang? I'm curious.
Well, I think what I love most about Auslan is that we have a lot of signs where there's no real English word that you can put to it.
Lost in translation.
Yes.
Lost in translation.
Yes.
Love it. Oh, you have just opened a can of worms.
Oh boy, here we go.
So my favourite sign is this. And sort of your lip pattern is sort of pa. And in English, it kind of means weird or odd or different, but not exactly, but it kind of means that. We use it in contexts where it sort of means that, but not exactly. And that's one of those signs that you can't quite explain in English.
Would you be able to put it into a sentence for us, and we can see how that would sort of translate out, so to speak?
Let me see. Perhaps if... maybe... Oh, I can't think of a sentence on the spot.
Sorry.
So, for example, if I saw someone walking down the street and they had a hat, but maybe their hat was funny and they were walking weird, then I might use that sign about that person. Or if there's something happening at the shop, so I can't get in through the normal entrance and I have to go some other bizarre way in, then I might use that sign about that shop.
Wow, it's so to my mind, it's kind of sitting somewhere in the realm of odd, curious, and almost queer, like this weird nexus of just sort of benevolently weird.
Look, we already know that other languages don't split up the semantic territory the same way, and so it's really nice to know that Auslan has its own lexical categories and words that we don't have. I love that.
I do as well. I also like the idea that I've always enjoyed the notion of codes and of being able to communicate without people around you knowing. And I feel like Auslan almost probably exists in a space where they're trying to combat that away. Like they want those walls to fall down. But I like that even if those walls were to fall down, you would still have these tiny... like sort of normal between other spoken languages lost in translation aspects that I find really almost romantic and quite adorable. And I like that that even past the larger barriers that maybe can be quite challenging for Auslan, there's these smaller ones that just all languages are always going to have.
Yeah, it's true. Well, tell you what, I think we should probably take a track.
Sure.
And we've talked a little bit about Auslan, but when we come back, I want to talk about the role of Auslan for Australian speakers. Let's hear a track by the Lilac Time, and this one is called Ear for Silent Voices.
You're on RTR FM 92.1.
the lilac time there with an ear for silent voices on RTRFM 92.1.
And if you're just joining us, we have two very special guests in the studio this week because we are discussing Auslan, the Australian Sign Language, and we have already discovered quite a few interesting things. Isn't that right, Daniel?
Yes, we are talking to Young Australian of the Year for 2015, Drisana Levitzke-Gray, and we are also joined by her interpreter, the wonderful Christy Filipich.
One question I have for you, Drisana, just during the break, it kind of made me think of it as we were talking about various idioms in different languages and stuff. Do you have a particular word or even a couple of words that you just like what I would say in English, the sound of? Like some expressions that you have, just the shape that you make is just one of your favourite. Even if the word itself, the meaning of the word is nothing special, the way you express it is your favourite?
I think so, and I think everyone has their own sign that they love the most. A friend of mine loves this sign, which is the sign for adoption.
Oh,
so you're actually bringing someone towards you.
I like that. That's awesome.
So she loves that sign. I like that sign I talked about before. The strange oddness of it, the meaning of it,
which I'm going to call. I think we can call bop bop. I think we
Yes.
could probably in bop bop. I like it.
I want to ask a question about the future of Auslan. There have been some reports that Auslan might be an endangered language, but even as we hear that, we can see signs of Auslan's influence increasing. Do you get a sense that it's growing or shrinking, or are we maintaining it? What's happening?
I think it's because we have these two competing needs. So we have a lot of hearing people who are really interested in learning Auslan. However, deaf children do not have access to Auslan. So that, I think, is where we have these competing interests. So the medical field, who are very focused on speech and listening, so audiologists, surgeons, paediatricians, they will focus very much on hearing and speaking and being normal, which we have to question, what does normal mean? And so that sort of relates to a lot of my advocacy, particularly for this year and looking forward, is about the human rights of deaf children to have access to Auslan, because it is consistently denied to them in our various systems and processes.
Why aren't they having access to Auslan?
Part of it is the ideology within the Society of Language. So language means speech, essentially. And the majority language in Australia is English, and the majority of deaf children are born to hearing English-speaking families. And so
who see their children's incapacity to speak as they speak as a lack rather than a difference.
Exactly. And so we need to change some of that mindset. So I think part of the issue is that back in the day, we had a lot of parents who learnt to sign with their deaf children back in the day, and they learnt how to sign and communicate with their children, and we seem to have lost that. Now, particularly with technological interventions like cochlear implants and hearing aids, that this will be a quick fix solution. And unfortunately it isn't. It's definitely not a quick fix at all.
What's interesting to me is that I'm a high school teacher, and part of my job requires me to go and see kids who are working in a workplace for work experience. And so last year, one of my students was working at hearing impaired school or a challenged hearing school in Mosman Park. Now, I grew up in and around Mosman Park, so I immediately assumed they referred to the giant school on the hill, the West Australian School for Deaf Education. So I went up there, but there's no one there. It's an empty facility. And so because of the integration of students into mainstream education, what I'm wondering, which for a lot of differently abled Australians has been a very, very good thing and has allowed them to not be sort of shunted into a clustered society where they feel very different. Do you feel like perhaps for hearing impaired children this is maybe not quite so positive, and that having a specific school for them up on the hill with views of the ocean and all these wonderful things was a better situation?
Definitely. I think that the ideology of inclusion doesn't really suit the deaf community in a lot of ways, because with our language, we need to have input through Auslan, and in a mainstream classroom, that's not how information is presented.
Yeah,
and so there's also this impression that there's something wrong with us as well, is often the impression that we have. And so it is difficult to have inclusion and actually have the deaf child included appropriately, because often they're still excluded even when they are included in a mainstream classroom.
Yeah.
And the impression is that everyone else around them is normal and better because they're hearing, and the deaf child in that mainstream classroom has a problem.
Right.
And there's also a lot of frustrations with that deaf child communicating with everyone else around them, and they have a lot of problems, and so they're not actually seen as equal members of the classroom and equal members of the school community. We have a lot of research about the mental health issues with young deaf people, and they're significantly higher than the normal population.
Well, I mean,
and part of
through a
that has
system
to do with the isolation that they feel.
I was just about to say, if you routinely exclude an isolated child through most of their formative years, unsurprisingly, there might be some mental health drawbacks to that environment.
Exactly, yeah.
What role is the internet playing in the promotion of Auslan? Is it helping because it gets people together, or is it hurting because most of the communication is in written English?
Well, I might give you an example from America, perhaps, in American Sign Language. So their community, they have college classes of ASL that are full every single year. Hearing students love to learn ASL, and they think that it's fantastic. And so with ASL, you can go to the shops and, you can just go down to the cafe and order something, and the person behind the bar knows some ASL. You can go almost anywhere and someone knows some ASL. And I think that's starting to happen this year. I think particularly because I've become the Young Australian of the Year, so I am getting a lot of media attention, and people are suddenly wanting to learn Auslan, which is fantastic. And that's wonderful. And, I really want Australians to embrace a language of Australia, which Auslan is. However, we really need to make sure that deaf children have got access to Auslan. And we need to make sure that it is in appropriate ways as well, that we're not necessarily relying on certain avenues like the internet, which can be useful but isn't useful necessarily all the time. We need to make sure that deaf children are accessing it in a really great way, that they're not then ending up having language issues, which then leads to cognitive issues, which then leads to education issues, which then leads to mental health issues. And when they're 18, they come to us as adults and come to learn Auslan, and by that time it's often a little bit too late. And unfortunately, we have a lot of these deaf people who haven't been raised very well, and they are then looked at by the Hearing Society as, well, that's what happens when you're deaf, and this is why we need to fix the deaf people. And
Wow.
So we end up sort of being looked down upon because of all of these issues that happen in early childhood. And so that's why I really need, we as a society, we need the government to take responsibility for deaf children and what's happening to them.
So what's your, if you got to sit down and write policy tomorrow, what's your magic bullet? What's the first and easiest, what's the low-hanging fruit to grab?
That deaf children and their family have access to Auslan. So an Auslan for Families program where a deaf person would come into the home and teach the family Auslan. So much money is given in terms of speech therapy and technology. So, for example, $100,000 per student, per child who's getting a cochlear implant is given to that essentially free, right? They get that service free, $100,000 subsidised cochlear implant with all of the everything around it. If you have a deaf child and you want to explore Auslan, you get nothing. So I would love to see that similar funding put into Auslan. And so if a deaf family chooses Auslan, it's not really about choosing one or the other. It's about choosing all of the things and having an actual appropriate way to access all of the things that is fair and balanced.
And let me just point out that a cochlear implant doesn't turn a deaf person into a hearing person.
No, not at all. Not at all. The last time I did some research, I think it might have given you about 60 different sounds through the various electrodes, and they're artificial sounds. I have friends with cochlear implants, and they've told me that things like water running out of a tap sounds like nails in a tin, for example, because they're artificial sounds. They're not natural sounds. And it can take years and years of really intense therapy for those artificial sounds to start to sound like what you would expect them to sound like. So that means that in those years of intensive therapy, they're missing out on education and they're missing out on language because they don't have access to it yet. And so that's really an issue that we have, this focus on speech and hearing. Whereas for myself, for example, I had an education. I didn't have all of that focus on speech and listening, and look at where I am. So we should have deaf children should automatically be coming out of the system looking like me and not the way that they are with deficient language and cognition.
Was it just by virtue of your parents being native speakers of Auslan as well that you received this kind of education, or what was your schooling environment like?
It's certainly because my parents are deaf, which means from birth I had access to language.
Right.
Back in the 90s, a friend of mine from Melbourne who was deaf and their parents were hearing, and at that time they had a program where if they were identified as deaf within the hospital, then aside from meeting doctors and audiologists and speech pathologists, they actually had a deaf adult come into the home for the next 3 months on various visits to talk with the family, to teach them Auslan, to tell them about the deaf community, and to tell them that deaf people could have jobs and be well-educated people. And so that deaf person has become quite confident and well-educated. His sister, who was born about 5 years later, they didn't have that service available. And so the parents just went with the cochlear implants and that kind of thing. So that's, if you have someone who is deaf meet the parents straight away and they see a deaf, successful, productive member of society, they don't have that panic that something's going to go wrong with their child, because their child is a day old and they've been told that they've failed. Their baby's failed and they've only just been born, and that really sets up a negative idea in parents' minds of what they can expect for their child.
Well, it's interesting because having just had a child, the situation you find yourself already in is a group of experts basically telling you information under the proviso that you couldn't possibly understand what they have to say.
Exactly.
The only information that you should really be paying attention to is what they're saying to you, which in a way is legitimate because they've spent, accumulated 25 years in education to figure out how they are doing the job that they're doing. But they have replaced the clergy before them as this voice of authority that we can't question. To question is to question the voice of God itself.
Oh, that's silly.
The situation is like that though, because doctors often present.
It's intimidating.
It can be, especially in an environment where you're so vulnerable from an experience, especially mothers who have just found themselves in a biophysical state that renders them vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. And the money, all of the funding goes towards medical intervention, and doctors make money if children have medical intervention. Doctors don't make money if they recommend you learn Auslan.
Let's take this from another angle. I want to put the case that Auslan would be beneficial for hearing people.
Definitely.
Certainly something we should do. So make the case. What are the benefits?
Okay, let me see. Well, at the moment, we already know that hearing parents with hearing babies are being told to sign with their baby, and they can sign at 6 and 8 months old and it improves their IQ and all these wonderful things about signing with babies that are hearing. But if you're born with a deaf baby, you're told, do not sign with them, you will ruin them for life. So we have to look at that and think, well, come on, whose research is real? If it's successful for hearing children, why wouldn't it be successful for a deaf child? And Auslan, particularly for children, it gives them an ability to communicate earlier and express their wants, their needs, their desires much earlier than they can express it verbally, simply because of gross motor development and fine motor development. We can use our limbs before we can use our mouths. So it also can improve their cognitive development because they already have signs for things that they then learn what they are. It can improve their visual acuity because they get used to where they have to use those things. And all of these things mean that various parts of their brain are activated much earlier and in different ways than just focusing on speech. So I think it's because Auslan is a real language, in the same way that being bilingual in any language is of benefit. Why
just
not,
like last
why
week's
not
show,
make it
Daniel.
Auslan? Yeah, so why not use Auslan, which is a language of Australia? And the more language you give to your children, the better. Why wait until they can, speak to you in proper sentences to give them language? Why not start, from the beginning? And when we're talking about deaf children, it's a human right.
I'm convinced. What's a good way for me to start learning Auslan?
Well, at the moment we have a couple of options. So you could learn conversational skills, so basic conversation Auslan at the WA Deaf Society. That's just in East Perth. They have 8-week courses, 2.5 hours for a class. And that sort of basic intermediate conversational skills. If you really want to learn the language and become proficient, then you can go to TAFE and you can do a diploma of Auslan. Which, if you're going to do the full diploma, takes 2 years, but obviously there's a Cert 2, 3, 4. You can choose how far you go. A lot of people will go to the WA Deaf Society first and get a bit of a taster, and a lot of people after that then go on and do the diploma of Auslan at TAFE.
Sounds great.
It's yet another language that we've now had added to the list that Daniel and I have been like, well, we're learning this language. So far we've got Noongar.
And Auslan.
I think there might have been another one.
Sentinelese.
And Klingon.
Oh, that's right, Klingon. We'll get to him one day. Well, we'd really like to thank both of you. We'd like to thank you, Drisana, for coming on the show and talking the talk with us, or signing the sign, as it were. We'll change the name of the show for this one episode. And Christy, thank you as well. Thank you as well for providing the voice.
Thank you.
A track?
Let's do. I thought that what did we have?
The other one you've circled was Kid, You'll Move Mountains.
Oh yes, because Drisana, I think you'll be doing great things. We chose a track by Caribou called Kid, You'll Move Mountains.
On RTR FM 92.1, The Sound Alternative.